For me, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the most exciting thing happening in cinema right now. As a lifelong fan of comic books and superheroes, the idea of the Marvel characters coming together in a shared universe is a dream come true. And they're not just cranking out superhero schlock for a quick buck. They're actually recruiting world-class talent for in front of and behind the cameras. The end result is one of the most consistent, high-quality franchises in film history. We're 17 movies in, and every single movie is fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. 8 of the movies have an 85% or higher. And all this is leading up to the big showdown with Thanos that we're finally going to get to see in May in Avengers Infinity War. This video is the first in a series of re-reviews I'm doing of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe I'm calling The Journey to Infinity War. What it's going to look like is every Monday I'm going to drop a new review of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in chronological order, every single one of them leading up to Infinity War. So today we're starting off with Iron Man. Week number 2 next Monday is going to be The Incredible Hulk. Week number 3 is going to be Iron Man 2. All the way leading up to it. So here's how this is going to work. First off, I'm going to do a retrospective of Iron Man and kind of the making of the movie. Second, I'm going to review the movie. Third, I'm going to talk about Iron Man and its place in the MCU. Fourth, I'm going to share some of you guys' take on the movie using the Stardust app. Fifth, I'm going to do a giveaway and tell you how you can be a part of the next giveaway. You can look down below in the description for the time codes on each of those things. But before I give my thoughts on it, tell me your take on it down below in the comment section. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you see it in the theater? Kind of what's your take on it? Let's have a lively discussion about this movie that kicked off this franchise that so many of us love so much. With that said, let's get started. In light of the popularity of Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man, it's easy to forget just how unlikely of a blockbuster an Iron Man movie starring Downey was at the time. While well known to comic book readers, Iron Man wasn't as well known to the general public as characters like Spider-Man and the X-Men. In the early 90s, Universal Studios acquired the rights to make a low-budget version of the character. This was around the same time that Punisher, Captain America, and Fantastic Four received similar low-budget treatments. A few years later, 20th Century Fox acquired the rights, and both Nicolas Cage and Tom Cruise expressed interest in starring. By the end of the 90s, New Line Cinema had acquired the rights to the film. Around that time, both Quentin Tarantino and Joss Whedon were approached to direct the film, but eventually New Line signed Nick Cassavetes, who would later make The Notebook, to direct. Different versions of the script were written by Alfred Gough and Millers Millar, who wrote Spider-Man 2, and David Hayter, who worked on X-Men 1 and 2 and later Watchmen. But after a couple of years of development, the project fell through and the rights reverted back to Marvel in 2005. The following year, Jon Favreau, the director of the hit Christmas movie Elf and the recent film Zathura, was hired to direct the film. When Favreau decided to hire Robert Downey Jr. in the lead role, he received significant pushback from Marvel. Downey had been an up-and-coming actor in the late 80s and early 90s, even receiving a Best Actor nomination for Chaplin. But for most of the 90s, he was making headlines for his substance abuse problems rather than his talent. Eventually, he would be fired from Ally McBeal and spend 6 months incarcerated. But Downey's past struggles in full view of the public was what drew Favreau to cast him to play Tony Stark. The film went into production without a complete script, and actors were encouraged to improvise their dialogue to give a more natural feel. The Nick Fury cameo was intentionally kept under wraps to maintain the surprise for audiences. Kevin Feige went so far as to remove the scene from press screenings. The movie was an instant hit with audiences and critics. The film grossed $585 million worldwide and earned a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. 16 films later, Iron Man still has the highest Rotten Tomatoes score of any film in the MCU. So there you have it. There's a little bit of background on where Iron Man came from. For me, this has always been a personal favorite of mine. I just loved it from the first time I saw it. I remember when I first heard they were making it and they had the director from Elf making an Iron Man movie, I just thought that was weird and I didn't know where they were going with it. And I saw the first poster and I pointed it out to my wife and she goes, "Who's Iron Man?" Like she had never heard of Iron Man before. And then the movie came out and like so many other people, we just fell in love with this movie. With that said, I'm going to go into my review and let's start it off with the good. And there's a lot of good with this one. The thing that makes this movie work is Robert Downey Jr. This is one of those times where you just have a hard time imagining anyone else playing this role and us getting the movies that we've gotten. And that kind of comes down to Robert Downey Jr. has amazing chemistry with everyone. Because it's not just that he's a one-man show giving off these zingers and these one-liners, it's his back and forth with all of the different characters that make him so fun and charming and likable while kind of being a total douchebag. His performance works with everyone else and makes them better, and you love the interactions. And that's true in this movie, and you see it from the very first time he starts talking to those troops in that Humvee at the beginning of the movie, and it's true in all the way to Spider-Man Homecoming when he's talking with Tom Holland. He is amazing in this role in a way that you just can't imagine other people being able to pull off. But it's not just Robert Downey Jr. that's great. The entire ensemble here is great. Gwyneth Paltrow's Pepper Potts just plays off Robert Downey Jr. so well. It can balance him out, and you can believe that she could put him in his place a little bit. I think Jeff Bridges is one of the underappreciated MCU villains. We'll talk about the storyline and what they do with the character a little bit later, but I think if they'd given him more time and perhaps given him an additional movie to be in and not just be kind of one of these one-and-done characters, he would be much more of one of the more memorable MCU villains. He does a great job in the role, and the way he's developed inside of the story, it makes sense that there'd be a jealousy, a power struggle, the elements that kind of work into it. I think his character just needed a little bit more time to grow and to be a great villain. Also, I think that Terrence Howard is much better than Don Cheadle at playing Rhodey. I mean, on all levels, I think that Terrence Howard is perfect in that role, and I feel Don Cheadle's a little bit miscast. You don't buy him as that type of character. That's not a knock on him as an actor, but that type of character seems a little bit off, whereas Terrence Howard feels like he fits into that military man that's buddies with Tony Stark. He wants to be able to have the fun with him, but because of his role, he has to put him in his place, and he's the guy that has to keep going up making these public announcements. All of it, I think he's perfect in it, and it's a real shame that whatever the funkiness came down that he didn't come back. But I loved him in that role, and that's another one of those things that his rapport back and forth, really, I mean, Robert Downey Jr.'s rapport back and forth with everyone in this movie is so good. Even Leslie Bibb's reporter character that feels like she would be a throwaway character in a different movie pops out in this movie, and all of her interactions back and forth with Robert Downey Jr. are great and memorable, and you want more of those little scenes because the chemistry, once again, is just great in this movie. Also, what makes this movie work is that it just has a wicked smart sense of humor. It's not just cheap laughs and sight gags, even though there are some sight gags in it. It just has a way to have a wit in all of kind of what's happening with impeccable timing, especially like in the scene where he's trying out the different suits and there's all these little jokes where he kind of bumps his head and the little arm going, ooh, and it works because the timing is just perfect. Also, this is a movie that's famous for launching the most successful cinematic universe in cinematic history, and the reason it is able to do that is that it did it so well. As an audience, we didn't know that they were establishing the pieces for a cinematic universe until the very end of the movie. It just wove into the plot line in a way that made sense. As Agent Coulson starts to show up, you're not thinking, oh, here we go, they're setting up the pieces for the sequels. You don't think they're setting up a TV show for 5 years in the future. No, it made sense that there'd be people trying to meet with him, and it was funny, and it played for jokes in the moment the first time you watched it without knowing what you were seeing, and it made absolute sense when you get the reveal that Agent Coulson is from S.H.I.E.L.D., and it sets up the pieces for the cameo and the after credit sequence perfectly. It laid the template for how to do it right, in that you tell your story properly and work in elements that make sense in the story without feeling forced into it or like little rabbit trails. Speaking of the world building, it did lay a really nice foundation of the tone of this world. Not just the story, not just the characters, but how do you take these comic book characters that can be very silly and have fun with them, but take them dead serious and craft a story that allows for all the elements that you want: the humor, the jokes, the drama, the character arcs, and it establishes how this world would do that. In other ways, it was very subversive to the genre. Now, the Tony Stark character lends himself to that, but we're used to heroes that want to be secretive and become very heroic once they become the hero, and they just only want to do right things and they're altruistic. And Tony Stark's not like that. He never stops being arrogant. He never stops being impulsive. He's someone that is always like that, but he ends up with a purpose by the end of the movie. And so when we see this character who is arrogant, full of himself, and you get to that final scene, and when we rewatched this last night with my wife, and we got to that final scene, she says, "Oh, this is the best part of the movie." And she's right. One of the absolute best things in the movie is the last line of the movie where Tony Stark walks out and boldly declares, "I am Iron Man," the opposite of what every comic book character, superhero had ever done in the movies. He just accepts it in the first movie in the franchise, the first movie in this shared universe. He just declares it out there, which is so different than what we've seen before, but so true to his character, which made it unique and interesting. And if you weren't there, if you weren't in the theater when that happened, and he just walks there and declares that, like, my theater was like, yeah, just broke out into cheers as he declared that. And it was just so fun to see something so fresh, new, and different. Kind of one final thing to talk about that ties into what I just talked about is that this is a movie that had a very strong character arc for Tony Stark. In that, like I said, he doesn't himself, his personality doesn't change, but you see a man discover his purpose. And there's these little scenes throughout the movie as you have him pause and he gets serious and he drops the sarcasm towards the end as he's talking to Pepper. And he says why he has to do this. And she's looking at him thinking he's crazy. He says these little lines like, "You would let me live self-destructive and selfish, but you won't let me live self-destructive to help other people." Like these little lines in there that actually are really potent and smart, because you can see why she would be so defensive of him. And at the same time, where this is a guy that would live recklessly and be like, "Hey, I'm living recklessly in a positive direction." And that just makes for amazing character arcs, character moments. And just as I started off to bookend all this, the positive, great relationships, great chemistry, interactions that you love to see and want to see more of. From there, let's kind of move on to the elements of this movie that are a little bit more mixed or feel a little bit out of place with the MCU looking back almost 10 years later. And there's a few very obvious things straight from the get-go. It's much slower paced, it has much less action, and the humor is far less overt. Now, if you've watched any of the MCU movies from 2017, which you almost certainly have seen all of them if you're watching this video, but they're just jam-packed, minute to minute, with joke. Everything is a quip. Everything is a setup for a sight gag. They're just jam-packed with humor, with action sequences. And so when you go back and you watch this movie, it can feel distant. Like it by now, it just movie to movie, it kind of built up to where it's at now. But looking back 10 years, it feels a bit out of place now. And there were definitely times in it was like, wow, this is a very different type of movie from where the MCU is at now, with the pacing and the scale of the action sequences seems so small scale compared to what we're used to now. And that's not necessarily a negative. It's a little bit mixed. Some people will like that. So for me, I kind of appreciate the fact that it's a movie that's more character-based, and we're pausing to have a lot of these great interactions that were improvised, as we talked about earlier. But a lot of people will watch it and feel like, what's the big deal? It's not nearly as funny. There's not nearly as many cool action sequences, and it's moving kind of slow. With that said, let's move on to talking about the bad. And the biggest issue for me was the plotting of the movie. I actually like the idea of the plot quite a bit, and I think it works. However, the execution gets a little bit clunky and slows down at certain points in time. So for example, after Iron Man escapes from the cave in the demo suit, and Tony Stark returns and says that he's gonna stop dealing in weapons, The plot slows down a good bit as there's a bunch of stuff about corporate takeovers and betrayals, and he's working on demo suits, and there's like 30 minutes between action sequences right there where there's a lot of plot happening, and then we move into the third act, and it feels very sudden how quickly Obadiah Stane turns into Ironmonger and becomes the mustache-twirling villain. And while the idea of it works if you look back on what happened previously in the film, he transitions so quickly that as you're watching the movie, it just seems like he goes full sociopath that's in a suit blowing people away that doesn't care if he gets caught very, very quickly. And then the movie does the comic book cliche of making him a one-and-done villain that they kill off, when I think there was a lot more that we could have done with Ironmonger in future films, and we didn't need to kill him off in this film. And one final negative on this one, the music in it, besides the AC/DC and Black Sabbath, which are amazing, feels very dated and forgettable. Listening to it, it doesn't feel like the score for a superhero movie, and it feels very much like the score of a movie that came out in 2008, and so I would hold that against the movie. As a film in general, I'd give this one an A-. It's got some great character moments, but the plot struggles a little bit. But when it comes to entertainment value, this is a 9.5 out of 10 for me. This is one of the most entertaining films that I saw in the theater and remains an incredibly entertaining film to this day. But the big thing is we're talking about the MCU in general. So if you watch this movie in light of how it ties into the MCU in general, in a lot of ways, it's one of the most standalone stories that we have, because we didn't know we were watching the first movie in a shared universe. We just thought we were watching a Tony Stark movie. And so in that, there's only a few things that set up elements that are of great importance to the larger cinematic universe, and all that ties back to the Shield and Nick Fury reveals in the third act of the movie, and it establishes that this world is building towards the Avengers. That there's someone out there named Nick Fury that works with this agency called Shield that wants to get a bunch of people like guys like Tony Stark and a bunch of superhuman type people to form a team together, and we get that in this film. There's some other Easter eggs along the way of little characters that we meet, but when it comes to the big picture of the MCU and that overarching meta-narrative that they're working towards, in this movie, really, Shield is the key thing that we learn about. With that said, I don't want to just talk about movies, I want to talk about movies with you, and so I like to share your take on movies. Here's what some of you had to say about the first Iron Man movie.
This is a great movie, with a phenomenal cast, phenomenal acting job done by Robert Downey Jr.
And I felt like one flaw that is really big, and it's just that the villain just goes crazy out of the blue for no reason.
And the whole sequence with him and the terrorists, the whole beginning's pretty good. I thought the last end sequence with the battle was fine, not that great, but overall a pretty good movie.
Jon Favreau is an absolutely amazing director for this project, and overall, it's just a great fun time, a great start to this universe.
So Iron Man is a really good movie. I'd say Iron Man is around about 7th.
It really fit in and didn't feel forced like other MCU movies. Definitely one of my favorite and an awesome movie.
This movie isn't my favorite of the MCU, but it's definitely a good movie. Robert Downey Jr. was born to play Tony Stark, and this is a great start to the MCU.
So that was some of you guys' takes on Iron Man. If you want to appear in one of my future videos, it's very simple. Download the Stardust app for your smartphone at that link down below in the description. It's totally free. Follow my account on there, and when you record reactions to movies, and I try and tell you in my videos which ones to do, MCU movies are probably good ones for the future. Just tag me in it. There's a little markup in the corner. You can tag that, add my name, and I'll see it in my feed, and perhaps you can appear in a future video. Along those same lines, I'm doing a giveaway for people that did reactions to Iron Man. I asked you guys a couple days ago. I'm doing 4 giveaways this month. You can learn about it. I think a link right up here on how to do that. But I had 16 different entries into it. I put their names literally into a hat. So we'll see who our first winner is. I got 8 different movies I'm giving away the digital code for. I got 3 more giveaways after this one. Our first winner is going to be Roddy Rod.
I watch this movie a good 3 times a year, man. Still, 10 years later. Still one of the best MCU movies. Still the best Iron Man movie. And one of the best origin movies of all time, man. this movie still holds up today, man. 9 out of 10, Iron Man.
Roddy Rod, you've been in my comment section for a while. You've been a good commenter and a good buddy of mine talking about movies. Roddy Rod, you are our first winner of one of the movies. I'll message you about that and find out which digital code you want. Like I said, if you want to be in one of the future giveaways, you can do it right up here. All you have to do is basically record a reaction to certain movies in the month of January before I put out my videos related to them. Find out the instructions right up here about what that looks like. With that said, thank you guys so much for watching and having some fun times going back and watching one of my favorite comic book movies of all time, talking about it. Hopefully down below in the comment section, we can have a lively discussion about all the different ways we've responded to it. Guys like me that were in our 20s when it came out, some of you guys that were in high school when it came out, and others that it's, you didn't see it until just a couple years ago after you'd seen many of the other movies in the MCU. I'd love it if we could get that different perspective in the comment section on all of that fun stuff. Come back next week when we're going to talk about the Incredible Hulk, the one that's kind of the black sheep of the MCU, because a lot of people forget about it because of the Edward Norton thing, because it was actually put out by Universal. So that's the one we're going to be talking about next week. And if you're new to my channel, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I do movie reviews, TV reviews, ranking videos, but the key thing is I don't want to just talk about movies. I want to talk about movies with you. So join me in the comment section. Let's talk about Iron Man. Join me over on Stardust. I'd love to see you on Stardust. And thank you so much for watching.